Well, and this is where I think we're seeing the Liberals trying to lay things out potentially for a spring election. There doesn't seem to be a lot of movement on important issues. There's a Bill C-15, which was Romeo Saganash's bill, that would enshrine into law the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It hasn't been brought forward. It was tabled in December. It hasn't been brought forward. We're apparently going to have a couple of hours debate in the next week or so, but there's no indication that the government really wants to move forward on it. There's also C-12, which is their environmental legislation that they tabled, and there was a backlash because it didn't have the binding targets that we need in a climate emergency for the next decade. And there again, they don't seem to be willing to bring it forward. That what they have been putting forward is the election bill, C-19, which is a bill to redefine elections during a pandemic, and which I think kind of speaks to their priority right now. So what we are going to be doing, and I want to come back to Pharmacare in a moment, because what I'm going to say now has implications backwards on this, is we are pressing the government in the coming budget. There's a budget that is coming forward. We have seen during this pandemic massive profiteering, unparalleled in Canadian history. The banks got $750 billion in liquidity supports. I mentioned this last time I was on the program. Absolutely obscene, and they got that within 4 days of the pandemic really hitting Canada. And they've had tens of billions of dollars in profits during the pandemic. We've seen Canadian billionaires increase their wealth by over $60 billion. There is no wealth tax. There is no pandemic profits tax. There's been no attempt to shut down on overseas tax havens, no attempt to try to have the web giants, companies like Amazon, actually pay their fair share of taxes. And so there is a strong push for establishing the ability for us to invest to help people. And you do that by the revenue side, which has been basically given up by Conservatives and Liberals over the last few decades. The obscene levels of inequality that we're seeing in this country are largely due to a complete absence of tax justice. If you're wealthy, if you're a big corporation, you get off scot-free. And then with those resources, if the NDP was writing the budget, those provisions would be put into place for sure. And with that budget, we'd be making these investments for Pharmacare, for dental care, for childcare, to make sure that there's a right to housing in this country. The types of motions that we put forward in the fall and up until December, including on a guaranteed livable basic income, Leah Gazan's initiative that the NDP caucus adopted and put to the House, voted down by Conservatives and Liberals. These are all measures that help us get through the pandemic and in the years beyond. And we know from the lessons of the Spanish flu that the recovery time economically for middle class and for lower income people will be over a decade. So the Liberal attempt to already start to cut back on programs in the next fiscal year is absurd and irresponsible. And so we want to create the resources and so we can make these investments to help people so that nobody's left behind. And these are the kinds of things that will be pressing the Liberals to put into the budget. Now, the one thing I wanted to come back to, Sean, is the issue of Pharmacare and what that means from a budgetary perspective. The Parliamentary Budgetary Officer tells us that by putting in place universal Pharmacare, we actually save about $4 billion as a country on the costs that we're already putting into place, in part because we have these for-profit insurance plans, and in part because we have dozens of different drug plans all competing for the same medication. And the New Zealand example is very indicative that you have bulk purchasing, you lower the costs of pharmaceuticals. So it actually costs $4 billion less to put into place Pharmacare than the existing patchwork that leaves 10 million Canadians out. And so the cost of actually implementing Pharmacare and the competitive advantage it gives to small businesses that no longer have to pay for drug plans because Pharmacare exists, the increase in wealth for lower income families that no longer have to struggle to pay for their medication, all of those things are add to our quality of life and to our fiscal situation. So on things like Pharmacare, it's really a no-brainer. We are wasting more money outside of Pharmacare, universal Pharmacare, than we would be spending as a country inside universal Pharmacare. And that's why we want to create, with the wealth tax and the pandemic's profits tax and cracking down on overseas tax havens, the ability, the fiscal ability of the federal government to put in place universal pharmacare.